This week we're looking at the origins of the Cold War. You have one secondary source, Patterson's The Origins of the Cold War, and then two secondary sources, Truman Doctrine and the President's Advisors Encourage Military Expansion, and then one clip of a documentary called The Atomic Cafe. So you should only watch the first 27 minutes of it, though of course feel free to watch the full hour and a half if you want. Following World War II, many of the world's major superpowers, Japan, Germany, France, and Great Britain, were in shambles. The two superpowers remaining were the United States and the USSR. After World War II, the US emerged as one of the greater powers with half of the world's manufacturing capacity and the only atomic nation. Roosevelt's vision was that the US would lead in world and international cooperation, expanding democracy, and increase the world's living standards. The Soviet Union was the only real challenger. It had a strong reputation for World War II military and industrial progress since the revolution, and it also envisioned a world based on its own national model, so you can see some tension. The Soviets were determined to establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe as protection. So the Cold War between the US and its allies and the USSR and its allies lasted from 1945 to 1991. So in other words, rather than World War II bringing about peace, it actually brought about a state of permanent war. So in 1947, the Truman Doctrine, which was the basis of US foreign policy for several decades, was one half of containment. The idea was that the U.S. must provide aid to freedom-loving peoples threatened by communism and assistance to anti-communist nations, no matter how undemocratic they were. This really divided the world into what was seen as free or enslaved nations with stark moral differences. The CIA, the National Security Council, the Atomic Energy Commission, and other national security agencies that were beyond democratic oversight were established as part of this mission. In 1947 as well, the other half of containment was the Marshall Plan. This was financial recovery of Europe. And it set out to challenge ideas that capitalism was flawed, which after the Great Depression was a pretty common idea. This was concerned about economic and political instability as a breeding ground for communism, and envisioned sort of a European New Deal. And so the Marshall Plan worked. By 1950, European manufacturing was rebuilt and further divided the West and the East, and Japan had a similar recovery. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested nuclear weapons, and in 1950, the National Security Council published NSC 68, which called for a permanent military buildup and increased military spending for, quote, survival of the free world. The nuclear arms race was one of the most alarming features of the Cold War superpower competition. Both sides rapidly expanded their nuclear stockpiles, and after several decades and a number of scares that sort of proved the whole world was at peril, the two countries each embarked on efforts to cut down the arsenal. The film Atomic Cafe will kind of get into what the buildup of it was like and how different Americans felt about the nuclear buildup and some of the debate, the internal debates over it, as well as the propaganda. The United Nations was established in 1945 as a goal to prevent another world war, and in some ways it was the successor of the League of Nations, which had failed after World War I for a variety of reasons. The real power then and now continues to be in the Security Council. This includes the establishment of peacekeeping operations, international sanctions, and the authorization of military action. It's the only UN body with the authority to issue binding resolutions to member states. And its initial members were China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The Cold War was complex, long, and fought essentially everywhere. You may have heard it described as an ideological war, a conflict between two sets of assumptions about how the world should work. This is partially true, though the two sides had more in common than you might think. It may be more helpful to think of it as, to consider it as a military conflict, an economic conflict, and a propaganda conflict. If I ask you to name the major conflicts of the Cold War, you would probably come up with the Vietnam War and maybe even the Korean War. Indeed, the Soviet Union and the United States used both Korea and Vietnam as venues for their conflict, each backing a different side of the Cold War. But to only acknowledge these provides a severely limited view of the U.S. military and CIA actions during the Cold War. As you read the Truman Doctrine, keep in mind that the most important goal of U.S. foreign policy was to stop the spread of communism. It's hard to make sense of foreign policy decisions that involve assassinations, coups, and other forms of destabilizing nations if you don't get that main goal. And, hard to make sense of it even if you do. I wanted to go through a couple of examples. In 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the country's oil reserves, angering the British Petroleum Company, which enjoyed a monopoly on Iranian oil. In 1953, British and U.S. intelligence agencies, SIS and CIA, overthrew the democratically government of Iranian prime minister and installed a king, or the Shah. In return, the Shah restored the foreign oil companies access to oil, though in this case the U.S. insisted that American companies share in the take. The new oil business in Iran went to BP, Royal Dutch Shell, Standard Oil of California, which is now Chevron, Texaco, also Chevron, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is ExxonMobil, and Standard Oil of New York, ExxonMobil. Meanwhile, the Shah imprisoned and executed political opponents by the thousands. And in 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and created an Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. In 1954, in Guatemala, there was a similar conflict. In the 1940s and 1950s, Guatemalan presidents implemented a series of reforms, such as minimum wage laws and outlawing debt slavery. This cut into the profits of the United Fruit Company, or today's Chiquita Banana. In 1954, the CIA overthrew democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz and installed a military dictator, Carlos Castillo Armas. Guatemala was ruled by U.S.-backed military dictators until 1996. In 1996, very recent. During that time, U.S.-backed dictators disappeared as many as 45,000 people. Officially, the CIA's mission was to overthrow a communist government. However, the CIA's own assessment was that Guatemala's leaders were influenced by the New Deal, not the Soviet Union. And then now in Chile, this is so Operation Condor was a much larger effort in Latin America to destabilize a number of countries. We'll focus on Chile. In the early 1970s, the CIA funneled around $8 million to right-wing groups in Chile to encourage revolt against President Salvador Allende. In 1973, Allende's government was overthrown in a military coup by Augusto Pinochet. The U.S. immediately backed Pinochet's military dictatorship, which arrested, tortured, and killed thousands of people. In just 3 years, Pinochet had imprisoned over 125,000 dissidents or suspected dissidents. So, as we look at these 3 examples, think about what kinds of common themes you saw. How were U.S. tax dollars being spent? What were they being used to do? How are they being funneled to support violent dictators? And then in return, what did those dictators do for U.S. and other Western corporations? So the goal of Cold War foreign policy for the U.S. was above all else to prevent other countries from choosing their own economic systems. Understanding that goal helps us to understand why the U.S. is willing to overthrow democratically elected governments and install military dictatorships. You can decide whether this was a sound goal and whether it was good foreign policy, but this strategy includes very negative side effects, blowback, or unintended consequences, which we will see all throughout the 20th century, or the second half of the 20th century, and certainly moving into the 21st century. So that's all for this week. I hope you enjoy the readings and Atomic Cafe. It's a really well done documentary.